We're here at an event called Limits to Growth Forum. What we need to be thinking about, what we need to be deciding, is what the economy would look like if we really took those limits to growth seriously. And that's really what my presentation is about today. I'm not going to cover policy. I'm going to really do the visioning work. If you want to look up the policy, I feel that the policy is really pretty well devised and established, and it's in a book I've written called Green Economics. It's not my work, but I kindly brought it together there in that book so you can find it easily. But that's not what I'm doing today. Today I'm doing something more about a vision of what a sustainable economy would look like. So I'm going to start off by telling you what some of the parameters are that we're working within. Again, that's not the focus of the presentation, but it's important that we get those established as some sort of ground rules. Now, the vision that I'm going to explain is called the bioregional economy, and really the reason I'm developing this stream of work is because when people first start taking an interest in the green economy, they really get very techy. They get really excited about, oh, we can create a much more energy efficient economy, and we can reduce, reuse and recycle, and we can create a circular economy, and all these kind of exciting phrases about technical redesigns of how we organise our production system. And those things are really important, but for reasons I'm going to show you in a minute, they're just nothing like enough. There's got to be a lot more attention on the sort of social science aspects of this, asking questions about what the good life is, about how our society is organised, and about what cultural determinants there are for why the economy keeps growing. So my answer to that is this thing called the bioregional economy, and that's what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about. And I'm going to talk about it from 3 points of view. Firstly, that these are basically the two main aspects of what an economy does. There's production and there's consumption. And we need to redefine the whole of what our economy is and how it works. So we need to look at those aspects, and actually we're talking about a whole paradigm shift here, a whole shift in the way we think about all aspects of the economy. So instead of thinking about production, we're going to be thinking about provisioning, and instead of thinking about consumption, we're going to be thinking about embedding. And obviously I'll go into more detail about what those mean. And then lastly, I'm going to be having a look at the exchange aspect of the economy and how exchange of goods will move from the market system into a more socially based and community system. So this slide is illustrating why it is we need to make these fundamental changes. I was speaking in Freiburg a couple of weeks ago with Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker, who is the man behind the Factor 4 model. Everybody got really excited about that. Oh, we can make our economy 4 times more efficient. But this is some work by Tim Jackson, which is trying to quantify how much more efficient we need to make our economic production processes if we're going to be able to keep within planetary limits. So what he's doing here is he's basically illustrating how expensive it is in energy terms to buy $1 worth of output. So he's measuring that in terms of grams of CO2. So the bar on the left there is what the world was capable of achieving in 2007. And to buy $1 worth of economic output, it took 768 grams of carbon dioxide. Now then he's got various scenarios here, and the scenarios relate to whether or not we think everybody on the planet has a right to an equivalent lifestyle, and how much population is going to increase over the next 40 years up to 2050. So let's assume we're going to go for that third scenario there. That's assuming population will only increase to 9 billion people, and that we think everybody has a right to live the same sort of lifestyle we live here. If we make those assumptions, then we see that we're going to be able to have to achieve $1 worth of output with only 14 grams of carbon dioxide. That's the sort of increases in efficiency we're looking at if we're going to be able to have a sustainable and just economic system for everybody who's going to be living on the planet in 2050. And that represents, I checked this out with you, didn't I? We reckon that represents a 60-fold increase in efficiency. So we're not talking about 4. Von Weizsäcker has now gone up to 5 times more efficient. We're talking about a 60-fold increase in the efficiency of our production systems. And I put it to you, my lad, that this is simply unrealistic. In fact, probably inconceivable within the physical laws we're working with here. So this kind of increasing the efficiency of our economy line is not going to do the trick. My next slide is giving me some sort of basis on which to decide how much energy we have available when I'm thinking about what the economy we're going to live in might look like. And this is the contraction and convergence model. How many people know the contraction and convergence model? Oh, about half. So basically the contraction is we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The convergence is we need to come towards equality, so we're all producing about the same amount of carbon dioxide. Everybody on the planet has an equal share of that carbon dioxide we can produce. In a nutshell, that's what the model's saying. So it's a radically egalitarian model, and something that might get international agreement. Apart from the politics, obviously. But at least it starts from a point of fairness, which is its main advantage. So what we're looking at in the UK, based on this kind of model, is 90% reductions in the amount of carbon dioxide we produce now. And that means we've got to come down to roughly 1 tonne, whereas we're at sort of 2.5 tonnes at the moment. So, you know, that's the kind of energy reductions we're looking at. And we have to think about what kind of economy we can realistically create when we have 90% less energy available than we have now. I also want to point out some problems with our global system that are not related to its environmental impact. And the first one is just that it's a very insecure system. This is a picture of Rotterdam Container Port. I always say that confidently, and then I think maybe it's not Rotterdam, but the point is it doesn't matter where it is. It could be any container port. It's an enormous, vastly energy-intensive city, isn't it? And we know that all across the world there are cities like that, and our provisioning, our access to basic resources relies on these kind of places. There's a really brilliant programme that they keep putting on BBC4 called The Box That Changed Britain, and I was thinking, what could that possibly be? What could that box be anyway? It's the container, and it's absolutely amazing how our lives have utterly changed as a result of containerisation, because it has enabled this massive transit of goods across the globe. But as I say here, it's obviously a very energy-intensive system. It means that we have these hugely extended supply chains, and you know, this buzzword now in the sustainability community, resilience, is hugely reduced by this. A few years ago, perhaps you remember, we nearly had to cancel Christmas because the container ship that was bringing Christmas from China had engine problems somewhere in the North Sea. You know, this is what we're talking about, kind of world where our Christmas depends on one ship. So you know, there are those kinds of problems with resilience and vulnerability, but there are also the problems around social living. And I think it was Richard was saying how our lives are, you know, our lives are much less meaningful because we don't have those close community bonds in work that we used to have. Here's another thing to think about. Where are those ports that we rely on for the transport of the goods that are important in maintaining our lifestyle? Well, obviously, they're all near the sea, aren't they? Because we're talking about global shipping. And these are exactly the places that are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise. So from all points of view, it looks like an extremely insecure system on which to base your livelihood. So the alternative I'm suggesting is a system of provisioning that's based on bioregions. Now, bioregions are a way of dividing up the Earth's surface according to natural boundaries. The countries and provinces and regions that we live in are there because of, you know, some war that happened in 1485 or some political agreement. They're not based in natural systems. So the bioregional movement said, well, let's start with nature's divisions. Let's start with rivers, watersheds, mountains, these kind of natural geographical features. Let's use them as the basis for the kind of systems, political and economic systems that we choose to live within. So as it says here, a bioregion is a life place. It's an area that has a certain geographical structure, a certain typical climate, water systems and so on, and because of those geological and hydrological systems, you also have particular species that are predominant there. And so you have basically a sense of place and a sort of culture of place that can build up around the bioregion. And beyond that, you can also see that human cultures will develop. And from an economic point of view, you might have particular species that would be particularly successful there. So a good example is the Somerset Levels, which is near where I live. You know, it's a wetland basically, so you have a lot of reeds growing there, and traditionally it was a great centre of basket making, and because there was basket making there, you know, people developed particular kinds of baskets for fishing, and there's a whole way that the sort of economy and the culture and the species all come together in a sort of meaningful whole. And that I see as one of the real benefits of a bioregional approach. And, you know, to some extent it's going to have to substitute for a lot of the things that no doubt you value greatly, which are too energy intensive to survive these 90% reductions. This is why I have a chapter in a new book called What About My iPod, which is my daughter's big question when she hears me talking about these kind of things. So as I said already, an economic bioregion would be about embedding yourself within that local area. So what you would aim to do is be self-sufficient within your bioregion. Partly what the bioregional economy is about sort of fleshing out this idea of localisation. It's been mentioned once, I think, here today, that a green economy would be a more local economy. But when you say, well, what is a local economy? How big is a local economy? People don't have answers to that question. They just kind of haven't thought that through. So this is one answer I'm offering. Yeah, the aim is to be self-sufficient within your bioregion, and it's not saying that there'll be no trade at all, but the trade there will be between bioregions will be based on this principle of trade subsidiarity. Trade subsidiarity just means you start with the local. So if you can supply your need locally, then you do. You only look further afield if there's actually not a local source of supply. So this is completely the opposite of the current trade system, which is based on making the maximum profit. You make things where people are cheapest, and you sell them where people can afford to pay most for them. And so this is an opposing principle where you will automatically start with the local. So at this point I have to tell you, it's only a model. As I said at the beginning, I'm not really presenting this as a kind of, I'm not coming here to sell you this as the unique vision of what a green economy will be like. What I'm doing is taking that 90% carbon dioxide limit seriously and then thinking about what types of economy we might be able to design. And basically what I'd like you to do is go away and do the same thing. Come up with a different model. Save your iPod, you know, save your holiday in the Bahamas if you can. You know, I'm basically challenging people to come up with a vision of the best type of economy we can get within that really strict energy limit. But what I'm not impressed by is people like Thomas Friedman, who will say, you know, oh, you know, who knows the work of Thomas Friedman? I have to teach it. It drives me absolutely nuts. So Thomas Friedman's first book is called, what's it called? The World is Flat. That's it. The World is Flat. Yeah, that kind of gives you a level of his, you know, an idea of his scientific level, really. No, so in The World is Flat, it's a great paean to globalisation. And then somebody told him over the next few years about climate change, and so his next book is called Hot, Flat and Crowded. And in that book, he basically doesn't want to change his vision. So what he says is, oh, well, you know, somebody's going to find a source of free electrons, or, you know, basically, he's waiting for the techno fix, and it's not there. This I see as a form of psychological denial, and I'm not prepared to engage with that. You know, if you've got the technology, then great, let's carry on with this lifestyle if it's what you like. But until that techno fix comes along, then you're going to have to work within my limit. But within that, any creative options are possible. And in fact, it's a necessary part of a green future, I think, that we will have diversity. We won't have this sort of global monoculture where every life, wherever you are, is the same. You know, and you can get your McDonald's burger in Jakarta or in, you know, Arkansas or wherever. But diversity is also the key. So this is just one model. I've got through about 7 slides and I've probably nearly run out of time. So this is the first bit, from production to provisioning. This is just my cartoon saying this is what happened before the crash, basically. All we had was the financial fiddles. China's making stuff, Indians are doing all the clever design work. What we're doing is selling financial fiddles, and now nobody wants them anymore, so a bit of a problem there. So yeah, as I already said, we're talking about a local economy. We're talking about an economy where cultural exchange is maximised. But we're not talking about autarky. If you talk about a local economy to an economist, they come back with this autarky word, which is like a really bad word in economics. You know? It means North Korea. And so it means no trade and, you know, a really miserable existence. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is starting with the local. You're aiming for self-sufficiency, but that's not to say you'll never have a pineapple or any coffee ever again. But one thing that might be useful to do is to see what your need really is. So is it actually coffee that you need, or is it, you know, the identity that comes from having a Cafe Nero cup, or is it some stimulus because you're so bored in the morning? Or, you know, let's try and define what your need is and then meet that from within the bioregion. So if we think about the pineapple, would an apple do as a good substitute? If not, why not? So, you know, that's the kind of thinking we need to be doing, not just like, I can't get a pineapple from within the bioregion, but really thinking cleverly and carefully about what our needs are and trying to meet them closer to home. I think this is an important point about how the bioregion would actually enable you to have real accountability for, basically for your backyard. One of the problems when we're trying to solve the problem of climate change on a global basis is that it's not clear really what you're responsible for. You have a sort of vague sense of guilt about the whole problem, and then you try very hard to do something in your own little life, but you know, you've always got that nagging doubt, and all these people are telling you, well, what's the point when they're building another power station in China every week? So I think the bioregional economy is really powerful in dealing with that problem, because what it does is make you responsible for one part of the planet, and because you know more or less what the carbon limit is, you can decide how you share that carbon out within your community. And so there's a real sense in which you're now responsible for that bit of land and the amount of carbon dioxide you produce. And as a community, you find responsible ways of, and ways of being accountable for that bit of the earth. And if we all protect our own little bit of the earth, then you know, we've solved the problem on a global basis. Just wanted to say something about cities, because cities are a real problem in my vision of the bioregional economy, because they're just so energy intensive. And so one of the important pieces of work that needs to be done is redesigning the city. There are some really great things about cities as well, culture and anonymity, which some people really like, and just all that cosmopolitan culture. And but all of that comes at a very high price, because the goods that come into the city are brought in from obviously a long way away, and that's a very energy intensive process. So this is from some work that Hervé Girardet is doing about redesigning cities, what he calls regenerative cities. And so this is what he calls Petropolis, and it's just an illustration of what I was just saying about the way everything has to be brought into the city from long distances and how energy intensive that is. And what he proposes instead is this regenerative city model where the city is now meeting a lot of its own provisioning needs from within its own boundary, and transport hubs are working much more on a circular basis rather than this sort of hub and spoke, which is so wasteful of energy. Anyway, you know, if you're interested in that, have a look at that. I'm basically working at the level of Stroud at the moment, which is only 15,000 people, and the reason I choose to do that is I think it's easier to start there, and I'd like to see what's possible there. But I don't ignore cities, and you know, I value this work, and I think it's a very important part of the solution we need to find. This is Banksy's take on the flight into Egypt. It's quite amusing living in an exemplar sustainable community as we are in Stroud, because you know, you can't really afford to fly abroad for a foreign holiday, because when you come back with that tan in the middle of November, you don't go out for a week or two. So you know, that's really part of what I'm trying to say. It's what I call the new consumption ethic. You know, we need to think about what it is to be cool. I mean, I'm not saying status competition is a good thing, but I think somebody asked a question about, you know, how much you should be able to earn, and I think it ought to be embarrassing really to earn more than a certain amount of money. I already feel quite embarrassed by my academic salary, so then I have to work fewer days, you know, so I haven't got too much money, and I feel that cultural pressures like that are actually really important in making the changes that we need to make. Anyway, from consumption to embedding. This is a little bit about embedding now, and what it gives you that buying consumer items doesn't give you. This is well, what can I say? It's a kind of group, it's these guys basically who have this thing called Walking the Land. They're artists, and one Friday a month they take us out and we all go and explore in enormous detail a part of our environment. So this is the River Severn and a local field. And you know, there's all sorts of ways they get you to be very good at looking and very good at connecting with your local environment. Because this disconnection between ourselves and our environment is really one of the basic sources of the problem. It's where the cultural problem starts. We just don't have a clear sense of connection with our environment. And so we don't really have a sense of how we might protect it. So that's one side of it, but the other side of it is that it's such a valuable experience, having a genuine connection with nature, that you really don't feel like going to a sort of superstore and buying another electronic gadget. You know, those things, at least speaking for myself, those things lose their appeal. Oh, it's waving at me. Okay, thank you for waving at me. Another example, which ask me about in the questions if you like, more about embedding in local food, a community farm I'm involved with. Sorry, I'll have to revise what I was going to say now. Okay, I won't do that bit. Just thinking about how we meet our need for goods and how we exchange goods. in a market system, it's a really sort of empty relationship, and the French degrowth movement talk about putting the economy back in its place and learning to think about this kind of economy and this kind of exchange in terms of human relationships, rather than that sort of empty market relationship that's just about exchanging goods for money. They go back to this concept of the Greeks, which was the agora, which was like, or you know, you could think of that Roman forum. Okay, people were buying and selling things, but they were also discussing politics and having these important social relationships. It's about public life and civil society. And you know, we may think that farmers' markets are the beginnings of us starting to see that kind of markets coming back in our communities as well. Something Richard was talking about is how much happier and healthier people are if they have strong social relationships, and that's another aspect of the bioregional economy, what Ivan Illich called conviviality. And he's making a point very similar here to the point that Richard was making, where once your social relationships decline below a certain level, it doesn't matter how productive your economy is, you're not going to be happy, because what we really need as human beings is these close relationships, and especially close relationships that make sense in terms of our work and our identity that we find through that work. So this is a kind of slogan really for the bioregional movement. Nature not as a place to visit, but nature as home. And you know, to me that's really what's important. It's about learning to value nature, not in some kind of cold, distant intellectual sense, but really feeling nature as home and really feeling the value of that. And if you start to get your provisions from your local environment, then all the time you're building that closer connection. The problem with this is that when you then go away from home, you do get a little bit weirded out. So I found it really strange being here in Falmer and also on your campus. It was, yeah, anyway, I mean, the upside is you're very well connected when you're at home, but the downside is it makes it a lot harder to travel. But anyway, generally I would say the journey is worthwhile. And there's where you can find out some more stuff. You very kindly referred to my blog, which sometimes has quite rude things on, has a whole variety of things. Feel free to join in the debate. The first website there is where I store all my kind of resources, so presentations and the other aspects of the work in building a green economy. Green economics has got quite a lot of policy stuff in, as well as some rationale for what a green economy might be like. And this last book here is a book, basically a textbook, so if you do any teaching or if you are studying a course about environment and economy, then that might be useful, because what I've tried to do there is, instead of sticking with, you know, economics is very single-minded kind of discipline. It's basically neoclassical, and then there are some others, so there's like orthodox and heterodox. But what I've done in this book here is tried to be pluralist, so I've tried to include all the different perspectives that you might take on that relationship between the economy and the environment, so that might be of interest as well. Okay, thank you very much.